Warning, some of the things that you're going to see on this list are going to be quite disturbing and are not for the faint-hearted. Number 10. Joe Ball the Alligator Man. Serial killer Joe Ball also became known as the Alligator Man after the remains of his victims were discovered at his tavern in Elmendorf, Texas. It is believed he killed as many as 20 women. Following probation, Ball opened the tavern where he often hosted cockfights. Then Ball decided to attract some real attention. He caught some alligators from the nearby low water areas and put them into a concrete pool. According to Elton Q. Jr., whose father helped investigate Ball, he said that any wild animal, possum, cat, dog or any other animal without an owner helped makes the show a little better. Get drunk, throw an animal in and watch the alligators. It wasn't long before women in the local area were being reported missing, including Ball's barmaids, former girlfriends and even his wife. In 1938, when deputies arrived to question Ball, he grabbed a handgun and shot himself dead. This was a man with a lot of secrets to hide. Police officers checked the pool and noticed the alligators were surrounded by rotten meat. They also discovered a mattress with blood and hair. They soon realized the fearsome Ball had killed and mutilated his victims and then threw them into the jaws of the beasts below. Number 9. John Hay. British serial killer John George Hay killed 6 victims between 1944 and 1949. He dissolved the bodies in sulfuric acid until they became liquid and poured the remains down the drain, earning him the nickname Acid Bath Murderer. He even sinisterly admitted to drinking their blood. Hay has already spent 4 years behind bars for fraud after he set up a false lawyer's office. Then, following his release, he turns to a more sinister get-rich-quick scheme. Hay first killed a young man and his parents, luring the victims to his basement in London like lambs to the slaughter, and then forged paperwork so he could financially benefit from their estate. His next victims were a wealthy couple who he shot and killed, then once again forged paperwork to take control of their estate. His final victim was an elderly lady who he killed and robbed of jewellery and other valuables, including her fur coat. When Hay was finally arrested, he stated, "I have destroyed the victims with acid. You can't prove a murder without a body." Hay genuinely believed he could not be charged if a body was not present. He was sentenced to death and hanged at Wandsworth Prison in 1949. Number 8. Robert Picton, the Pig Farmer. Canadian serial killer Robert Picton was a pig farmer who would grind up his victims and sell the remains as mincemeat. Between 1983 and 2002, he murdered 6 victims in Vancouver by either injecting them with antifreeze or stabbing them to death. In 1997, one woman escaped from the farm and managed to flee, naked and suffering from stab wounds. She ran to the police, but they dismissed her claims, believing she was an unreliable witness. Picton eventually confessed to an undercover officer who was posing as his cellmate. When asked about the best way to dispose of a body, Picton said, "A rending plant converts animal tissue into more useful materials like lard." This was Picton's favourite twisted method, and once he minced up the bodies, he sold the remains off as meat. He also confessed, "I made my own grave by being sloppy." It is believed the real victim count could be 49 women, as Picton told the undercover officer he was aiming for the big 50. He was sentenced to life behind bars with no possibility of parole. Number 7. Zhang Yongming. In 2012, Chinese serial killer Zhang Yongming, who became known as the cannibal monster of Yan'an, was found guilty of killing 11 young men. He would either dismember, burn or bury the bodies. Some remains he also fed to his dog, and other remains he sold to a local market in Kunying City, which he led police to believe was ostrich meat. Young Ming had already been convicted of murder in 1979, but was released from prison in 1997. He became a suspect in the murders when many young boys started going missing near his home, and parents feared they had been sold into slave labour. One boy was grabbed around the neck by Young Ming's belt, but he luckily managed to escape. Police then discovered human remains inside his home, including flesh hanging from the ceiling and eyeballs in wine bottles. A statement released by the court said, "He used cruel means to kill the victims, and the circumstances and consequences were especially serious." In 2013, he was escorted to an execution site and executed. Number 6. La Bestia. Between 1992 and 1999, Luis Gravito terrified the streets of Colombia as he travelled to as many as 54 towns in the country, in various disguises, where he lured young boys aged between 8 and 16 years old to their death. Gravito, also known as La Bestia, which translates to the beast, would walk his young victims for miles so they became tired. Then he would tie them up and torture them. He also mutilated their genitals. The boys were mostly street kids who were separated from their families, so many of the murders went undetected. Then in 1997, a mass grave site in a ravine in Perea, initially thought to be the work of a satanic cult, was uncovered, containing the remains of 25 children. This is where Gravito dumped the bodies, and he almost got away with it. Luckily, investigators discovered spectacles at the gravesite, which had a rare prescription leading directly to the killer. Following his arrest, photos of the victims and journals including a tally chart of his victims were found at his apartment. Gravito eventually confessed to more than 300 murders, and 138 were confirmed. He was sentenced to life in prison. Number 5. John Christie. British serial killer John Christie murdered 6 women, including his wife, in the 1940s and 1950s. In 1938, he moved into 10 Rillington Place, West London, with his wife Ethel. Then a decade later, his marital home became a house of horrors as he hid the bodies of his victims within the walls and grounds of the property. His first 2 victims, 21-year-old Ruth Forrest and 32-year-old Muriel Eady, were buried in the garden. Next was his neighbour, 20-year-old Beryl Evans, who he disposed of in a sewer drain. Her husband was wrongfully accused and executed for the murder. Christie was running out of room in the garden, so he began stuffing the bodies within the walls of his kitchen. 25-year-old Rita Nelson, 26-year-old Kathleen Maloney, and 26-year-old Hectorina McLean were later discovered there. The stench of the rotting bodies hidden within the walls eventually became overpowering, and he moved from the house. When the new residents renovated the kitchen, they discovered the source of the gruesome smell and also recovered the body of Ethel Christie from under the floorboards in the parlour. Christie was hanged for his crimes in 1953. Number 4. Gary Heidnick. Gary Heidnick is one of the most grotesque serial killers of all time. In 1986 and 1987, he kidnapped and tortured 6 women, trapping them in his basement in Philadelphia. What happened in that basement is so terrifying it reads like a horror movie. Former FBI profiler and author John Douglas revealed that Heidnick still haunts him today. Douglas said that Heidnick was even worse than the guy Buffalo Bill in the movie Silence of the Lambs. He would fill the pit up with water and not drown his victims, but have them stand in the water up to their necks and then get electric wire and torture them while they were in the water. What made it even worse, after he killed them, he then would put his victims in a meat grinder and fed them to his other victims. Luckily, one victim managed to convince the depraved killer to let her go temporarily so she could visit her family. She managed to make her way to a phone booth and called 911. Heidnick was executed by lethal ejection in 1999. Number 3. Albert Fish. Albert Fish was a child serial killer and cannibal who took the lives of 8-year-old Frances McDonnell, 8-year-old Billy Gaffney, and 10-year-old Grace Budd. Fish later boasted that during his reign of terror, he had children in every state and that the real victim count was around the 100 mark. After the murders, he continued to terrorize the parents of his victims. Fish penned a sinister letter to the mother of Grace Budd, explaining in haunting detail how he dismembered and cooked the remains of the young girl. Fish wrote, "Cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms and eat it. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body." However, the letter was the downfall of Fish, as he used an envelope that was emblazoned with the address of his rooming house in New York City. Fish made no attempt to deny any of the murders, and he was executed by electrocution at Sing Sing Prison in New York in 1936. Number 2. Dr. H H Holmes. Born Herman Mudgett, later changing his name to Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, this notorious monster is widely known as America's first serial killer. In 1893, he built a hotel in Chicago, which was nothing less than a giant, elaborate torture chamber in which rooms contained unusual and cruel ways to die. He eventually confessed to 27 murders, although the real victim count was most likely around the 200. At his murder castle, he would lure victims with the offer of work at his pharmacy, then insist they take out a life insurance policy of which he was the sole beneficiary. Once they disappeared into the hotel, never to be seen again, Holmes became an expert in disposing of the dead. Also, his medical connections through the pharmacy enabled him to sell on organs and skeletons to medical schools, who were always demanding more cadavers for their students. Holmes later stated, "I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer." He was hanged for his crimes in 1896. Number 1. Ed Gein. Imagine becoming such a gruesome serial killer that your very crimes inspired the likes of Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. Following her death in 1945, Ed claimed he had lost the only woman he ever loved. At their home located on a remote farm in Plainfield, Wisconsin, he boarded up all the rooms once used by his mother and resided alone in the small kitchen. Ed then murdered 2 women and dug up the graves of many other females. When detectives arrived at his home, as he was the last person to have seen one of the victims alive, they found a scene that nobody could have prepared for. They found a decapitated corpse, organs in jars, skulls used as bedposts, a belt made of human nipples, 9 vulvas in a shoebox, and masks made of human skin. Ed spent the rest of his days inside a mental health institute and died at the age of 77 years old. And that was 10 gruesome ways serial killers disposed of their victims. So guys, what did you think of that list? I really hope you were able to keep your food down. In fact, I really hope that you were not eating while watching this video. So let me know your thoughts in the comments box below. Was there anyone that you think that I may have missed? If so, let me know and I might make a part 2. Okay guys, well if you're still watching this video, then thank you all for sticking around. Make sure you smash that subscribe button, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you all again very soon.